Okay, so let's dive right in. We're going to tackle, well, one of the deepest, most personal mysteries there is. What does it actually feel like to be you? Right now, as you're listening, you've got this whole inner world going on, maybe the feeling of the chair, the sound of our voices, colors you're seeing, just that stream of thoughts. That's your subjective experience. But like, where does it actually come from? And how does it connect to the physical stuff, your brain, your body? It's maybe the ultimate puzzle.
It really is. And this question, the mind-body problem,
Mm-hmm.
it sounds simple, but unpacking it is incredibly complex because it touches on everything, doesn't it? From neuron firings all the way up to these really abstract philosophical ideas.
Absolutely, and that's exactly the journey for today's deep dive. We're looking at a whole bunch of fascinating forces. They tackle this head on, but from like completely different angles. We've got some cutting-edge neuroscience looking at brain computation in new ways. Then there's philosophy going back centuries. What do mind and body even mean? And some really interesting modern thought experiments, too, designed to kind of poke at our intuitions.
Yeah, our goal here is really to sift through all this material, pull out the key insights, understand the different takes, and hopefully get a clearer picture or, maybe just a clearer grasp of why the problem itself is so tricky. It's all about exploring what it means to think, to feel, to have that unique first-person view on everything.
Okay, so let's kick off with the science. There's this perspective that tries to move beyond just, finding the consciousness spot in the brain. It asked about the fundamental processes needed for that subjective spark.
Right, and that's the approach you see in this paper by Key and Zaluki. It's called a first principles approach to subjective experience. See, traditionally, neuroscience, it's been hunting for these neural correlates of consciousness.
Correlates, okay. Like mapping brain activity to experiences.
Exactly. Like saying, okay, when you see red, this bit of the brain lights up. Finding the association.
Right, pinpointing the physical location.
But Key and Zaluki, they suggest something different. Almost like reverse engineering it.
Reverse engineering, how so?
Instead of asking where consciousness happens, they're asking, what are the absolutely critical neural computations? What needs to be going on fundamentally for subjective experience to even be possible? Yeah. What are the necessary ingredients?
Ah, okay. So it's less about geography and more about the underlying mechanism, the what, not the where.
It's a really fundamental shift, yeah. And they propose that the most basic neural process, the foundation for subjective experience, is awareness.
Awareness. Okay, that sounds pretty intuitive, doesn't it? You need to be aware to experience something.
You'd think so, right. And you see this in higher order theories of consciousness, too. They really emphasize awareness of something, or even awareness of your own thoughts. And the link is pretty undeniable when you look at cases like, say, deep anesthesia or really severe brain injury. They reference a paper by Bali and others from 2013, basically. If you lose that capacity for awareness, subjective experience just goes. There's literally nothing it is like to be in that state.
Okay, so awareness is definitely necessary.
Yeah.
But does that just mean conscious perception, like me consciously noticing this microphone?
Well, that's where they add this really crucial layer. They argue against that narrow view. They bring in this idea of preconscious awareness, something that happens before you get to full, explicit conscious awareness. They cite their own work on this from 2021. And this preconscious awareness, they argue, that's the even more fundamental building block.
Preconscious awareness. What does that actually mean? How is it different?
Okay, so they define awareness, and this is interesting. For any system, biological or maybe even AI as the system, basically knowing or, let's say, understanding something about its own internal state, its own processes.
Knowing about its own workings.
Yeah, but this knowing doesn't have to be like thinking in words, I am processing visual data. It can be implicit, kind of like how your body implicitly knows how to balance. Dans and Perner talked about this explicit distinction back in '99.
So a system brain, computer, whatever it becomes aware, at least preconsciously, when it can sort of figure out the relationships within itself, like how its inputs relate to its outputs and internal states.
Exactly. When it can predict or infer those internal relationships. And this is where it gets really wild and maybe a bit counterintuitive. Our nervous systems, our brains, they have absolutely no direct line to the outside world. None at all.
Wait, what? No direct access, but it feels like I'm directly seeing you right now.
I know, right? But think about it. Your brain isn't seeing light waves. It's getting electrical signals from your eyes, which were triggered by light. It doesn't directly feel the warmth of the room. It gets signals from receptors in your skin about temperature changes.
Okay, so the brain only ever deals with its own internal signals, nerve impulses, neurotransmitters, that kind of thing.
That's it. It's locked in the dark, bony box of the skull, just processing its own internal information streams. So your subjective experience, seeing the colors in this room, hearing my voice that's not like a window opening directly onto the world,
Yeah.
it's something constructed entirely inside your brain, based on its awareness of its own internal processing of those signals.
Oh,
And because it only has these internal signals, all the nervous system can do is try to predict or infer what must have caused them out there in the world. Predict the content, the quality of the stimulus.
okay. Is this why people like Anil Seth talk about the brain being a prediction machine? Is that the connection?
That's exactly it. Our perception, our actions, it's all driven by the brain's best guesses. It uses internal models to constantly predict the causes of the sensory signals it's receiving. And here's the crucial link back to subjective experience, according to Key and Zalewski's argument. For an animal, or us, to subjectively experience the quality of something, the redness of red, the sharpness of a pain, they must have that ability to predict or infer their own internal processing using these models.
That preconscious awareness.
Yes. Without that internal knowing, that prediction of its own activity, the brain might still process the signal, but there'd be no feel. Know what it's like.
So preconscious awareness, the brain knowing and predicting its own processing, is a necessary condition. You need it for subjective experience.
Necessary, yes. But, and this is important, they're careful to say it's not sufficient.
Not sufficient. Okay, so there's still something missing. It
Yeah.
doesn't get you all the way there on its own.
Exactly. There's more to the story to get from that basic internal awareness to the full richness of conscious subjective experience.
And this is where they bring in that experiment, right? Trying to isolate this scientifically using TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Right, TMS and phosphines. See, the big challenge in studying subjective experience is finding a way to compare having an experience versus not having it while keeping the external world the same. It's tricky.
Because if you just show someone something faint, and sometimes they see it, sometimes they don't, attention and other stuff gets in the way.
Exactly. So they use TMS. It uses magnetic pulses to directly stimulate a specific part of the brain, in this case, the visual cortex. And this can create a very simple visual sensation, a flash of light, basically. It's called a phosphine. And importantly, it bypasses the eyes entirely. No external stimulus needed.
Ah, so you're creating the percept directly in the brain.
Precisely. And by carefully adjusting the TMS intensity, they can set it right at the threshold. So the person reports consciously seeing the flash only about half the time, even though the pulse is delivered, based on earlier work by Taylor and others.
That's clever.
Yeah.
Because it's a really simple, controlled experience. Just a flash.
Yeah.
Not like trying to study the experience of seeing, I don't know, a complex painting.
It simplifies things a lot, although they do acknowledge limitations, like the person is still looking at a screen, there's a fixation point, so there are other visual inputs, but it's much cleaner than many paradigms.
Okay, so you run these trials. Sometimes the person gets the TMS pulse and says, yep, saw a flash. Other times, same pulse, same intensity. They say, nope, nothing, and you're recording brain activity the whole time.
That's the setup. Then comes the key step. Subtraction.
Subtraction.
They take the pattern of brain activity recorded during the trials where the phosphine was unseen,
Okay.
and they mathematically subtract that pattern from the brain activity recorded during the trials where the phosphine was seen.
Right. So what does that subtraction achieve? What are you left with?
Well, according to their interpretation, the activity that's present, even when the flash is unseen, represents the basic neural processing needed to just generate the potential for that visual content, the underlying representation of the flash. By subtracting that away.
You're removing the part that's just about processing the stimulus itself, whether it's felt or not.
Exactly. So what's left over, theoretically, is the neural activity specifically associated with the subjective experience of seeing it, the feeling, the awareness, the qualia of the flash.
Wow. Okay, so it's an attempt to use neuroscience to actually isolate the brain activity that corresponds purely to the feeling part, the what it's like-ness, separate from just the processing of the information.
It's a really direct scientific stab at that core mystery, yeah, trying to find the neural basis of qualia itself.
Which is a perfect bridge, actually, because that scientific quest connects directly to these huge philosophical debates that have been going on for centuries. The mind-body problem.
Absolutely. This relationship between brain activity, physical stuff, and subjective feeling, that's the modern face of a very, very old question. How do mind and body relate? Are they separate? How do they interact?
And this goes way back, right? Ancient Greece? Plato.
Oh yeah, Plato was definitely a key figure here. He had a view that sounds very dualistic to us now. He thought the soul, the mind, was fundamentally different from the physical body, immortal, rational, originating from this perfect, unchanging world of forms or ideas. That's where true reality was for him.
And the body?
The body was part of the imperfect, changing, material world, temporary, physical, almost like a prison or distraction for the soul, preventing it from accessing those pure forms directly. It only perceived shadows, not the real thing.
That's a very stark separation. What about Aristotle, his student? Did he agree?
No, Aristotle took a very different path. He really pushed back against the idea of the soul as a separate thing that could exist without the body. For Aristotle, the soul was the form of the body, which sounds a bit abstract, but think of it like the soul is the set of capacities and functions that make a particular body alive and operate as that specific kind of living thing.
So it's more about the organization and abilities, like the aliveness and thinkingness of the body.
Kind of, yeah. It's what enables the body to live, to perceive, to think, to grow, to move. It's inseparable from the physical structure. You can't have the soul without the body, or that specific body without its soul or form. Some people even see hints of functionalism in Aristotle, though that's debated.
Interesting. So right from the beginning, you had these two major poles.
Yeah.
Mind-soul as distinct versus mind-soul as fundamentally tied to the physical structure and function.
And that dualist view, the separation view, it got a huge injection of energy during the scientific revolution around the 17th century. Science was making incredible progress by treating the physical world, including bodies, as material machines, things you could dissect, measure, break down into parts.
Materialism and reductionism.
Exactly, focusing on matter, breaking things down. And this became the dominant way to study bodies, anatomy, physiology. It all treated the body as a complex physical system. And as one source notes, this really cemented mind-body dualism as the standard way of thinking in medicine and biology for a very long time.
And the big name associated with this period's dualism is Descartes, right?
René Descartes, absolutely. He famously drew a very sharp line between the thinking substance, res cogitans, the mind and extended substance, res extensa, physical matter, the body.
Mind is thought, consciousness not extended in space. Body is extension, physical stuff, no consciousness.
Precisely. His famous "I think, therefore I am" really emphasizes the mind as the primary known thing.
But this sharp divide immediately creates that massive headache, the interaction problem.
The absolute classic problem for dualism. If mind is totally non-physical and body is totally physical, how in the world do they affect each other?
How does my non-physical decision make my physical arm move? How does physical light hitting my eye cause a non-physical feeling of red?
Exactly. Descartes vaguely suggested maybe they interact via the pineal gland in the brain, but his contemporaries, like Leibniz and Malebranche, jumped on this. How can something non-spatial, non-physical push things around in the physical world? It seemed to violate the basic principles of physics, even as they were understood then.
Right, cause and effect seem to require physical contact or force.
Which led to some pretty creative solutions from later dualists trying to fix this. Malebranche came up with occasionalism.
Occasionalism.
The idea that mind and body don't directly interact. Instead, God steps in on every single occasion to make the connection. You will your arm to move, God makes the arm move, light hits your eye, God creates the sensation in your mind.
Wow, so God is constantly mediating between minds and body.
Pretty much. Leibniz offered a different solution. Parallelism, or pre-established harmony. He said mind and body are like two perfect clocks wound up by God at the beginning of time to run in perfect synchrony, but never actually influencing each other.
So they just look like they're interacting because they're perfectly coordinated?
That's the idea. Mental events only cause other mental events. Physical events only cause other physical events, but they run in parallel harmony.
Okay, these are intricate ways to try and preserve dualism without direct interaction. So dualism has this long history, this core interaction problem, but it's not totally dead, right? People still defend forms of it.
Definitely. You still find defenders of substance dualism. Mind and body are fundamentally different kinds of stuff. Then there's emergent dualism. This is the idea that mental stuff or mental properties somehow emerge when physical systems like brains become complex enough.
So consciousness isn't there in simple matter, but it pops into existence from complexity, and once it's there, it's genuinely non-physical.
That's the rough idea, yeah. Philosophers like Hasker, Zimmerman argue for views like this. And perhaps more common today is property dualism. This says there's only one kind of substance, physical substance, but it can have two fundamentally different kinds of properties. physical properties and mental properties.
So my brain state has physical properties like neurons firing, and also maybe a genuinely non-physical property like feeling painful.
Exactly. The mental property isn't reducible to or identical with any purely physical property or combination of physical properties. A popular version of this is non-reductive physicalism. People like John Searle or Donald Davidson fit here, roughly. They'd say mental states are caused by physical states and can cause physical states, but the mental properties themselves aren't just physical properties. Searle calls consciousness a biological feature, but with an irreducible first-person feel.
Okay, so that's the dualist family tree, more or less,
Yeah.
arguing for some kind of fundamental distinction. What was the big materialist alternative that really took hold in the 20th century?
That would definitely be functionalism. It really rose to prominence partly as a response to the problems with behaviorism.
Right, behaviorism tried to get rid of talking about the mind altogether, just focus on observable behavior.
Yeah, there was logical behaviorism. Think Ryle, Wittgenstein saying mental talk just means talk about behavior. Bob is thirsty just means Bob is disposed to drink if water is available, and so on. Trying to translate away the internal.
But that always felt like it was missing something crucial, the inner experience.
Totally. And empirical behaviorism, like Watson and Skinner, struggled too. Critics like Chomsky famously argued you just couldn't explain complex behavior like language without assuming internal mental states, beliefs, desires, goals, understanding. This paved the way for the cognitive revolution, bringing talk of internal mental states back into psychology and philosophy, leading to what's sometimes called psychofunctionalism.
So functionalism allowed people to talk about internal states again, but in a way that was still compatible with a broadly materialistic worldview.
That's the core appeal, functionalism says. A mental state isn't defined by the stuff it's made of, brain cells, silicon chips, ectoplasm, whatever. It's defined by its causal role, its function.
What it does.
Exactly. What causes it, inputs, how it interacts with other mental states, and what it causes, outputs, like behavior.
Like the classic computer analogy. The software, the mental state, is defined by its operations, not the specific hardware, the brain, it happens to run on.
Perfect analogy. So for a functionalist, pain isn't defined as C fiber firing. It's defined as the state that's typically caused by tissue damage, tends to cause distress and avoidance beliefs, and tends to cause wincing or crying out. This functional description is topic neutral. It describes the role, and theoretically different kinds of physical systems, or maybe even non-physical systems, could fulfill that role.
And some functionalists took that computer analogy very literally, right? Machine state functionalism.
Yeah, Hilary Putnam was famous for this early on. The idea was you could see the mind as a kind of abstract computational system, like a Turing machine, defined by a machine table that specifies, for any given state and input, what the next state and output will be. Mind as the program, brain as the hardware implementing it.
Okay. And within functionalism, you mentioned this distinction, role versus realizer.
Right. It's a bit subtle but important. Role functionalism says the mental state is the higher level functional role itself. Pain is the property of playing the pain role in the system. Realizer functionalism, or sometimes called functional specification, says the mental state is the lower level physical state that happens to occupy or realize that role in a particular type of system.
So in humans, pain is C fiber firing, because C fiber firing is the thing that does the job specified by the pain role in us.
Exactly. Pain is the job description, the
Yeah.
role.
Yeah.
C fiber firing is the current employee filling that role, the realizer, in humans. It could be something else in an octopus or an alien.
Got it. And that raises tricky questions about how the role and the realizer both cause things without double causing.
Yeah, the problem of causal overdetermination. If both the functional state and the physical state cause the wincing, which one is the real cause? Philosophers get into deep debates about determinables and determinants or causal powers, trying to sort that out. It's complex.
Okay, so functionalism seems neat, fixed with cognitive science, but it has that big, persistent problem we keep coming back to.
The Achilles heel, yes. Can functionalism defining states purely by their causal relations actually capture the phenomenal character, the raw feel, the qualia, the what it's like?
It tells you what pain does, but does it tell you what pain feels like?
That's the million-dollar question. This is the explanatory gap Joseph Levine talked about. Why should this particular pattern of causal roles realized by this specific physical activity feel like the specific agony of a burn or the particular hue of red rather than feeling like something else or like nothing at all? The functional description seems to leave out that intrinsic subjective quality.
And this feeling that something is left out, This is what powers those big arguments against physicalism and functionalism, like the knowledge argument.
Exactly. Frank Jackson's famous Mary thought experiment, it's designed precisely to pump that intuition.
Let's walk through it again. Mary, brilliant scientist.
Brilliant neuroscientist, yeah. Specializes in color vision. But she's lived her entire life in a totally black and white environment, never seen color, but she has learned everything there is to know physically about color and color vision. All the physics of light waves, the neurobiology of the eye and brain, which brain states correspond to seeing red, seeing green, literally all the physical information.
Complete physical knowledge from her black and white room.
Then, one day, she's released from the room. She walks outside and sees a ripe red tomato for the first time. The question is, does Mary learn anything new?
And the immediate strong intuition for most people is, yes, of course she does.
She learns what it's like to see red, that subjective quality.
Right, the raw feel.
So the argument goes, if she knew all the physical facts before leaving the room, but she learned something new when she saw red, then this new knowledge must be about something non-physical. That subjective experience, the qualia of red, it's not captured by the physical facts alone. Therefore, physicalism, the idea that everything is physical, must be false.
It feels like a knockout punch, doesn't it? But you said earlier, the source points out it rests on a lot of debatable assumptions.
Oh, absolutely. It's hugely debated. The source mentions 9 controversial points. Things like, what exactly counts as physical information? Is it even possible to know all of it? What kind of knowledge does she gain? Is it new information or a new ability or just getting acquainted with something? Does physicalism even require that phenomenal facts be deducible from physical facts? It gets very complicated very quickly.
So the intuition is strong, but the logical path to physicalism is false, has pitfalls.
Many potential pitfalls, according to its critics, and there are other arguments trying to get at the same intuition, often using conceivability.
If you can conceive it, maybe it's possible, like inverted qualia.
Right. Imagine your inverted twin, physically identical to you, atom for atom. Functionally identical, behaves the same way, uses words the same way. But when they look at something you experience as red, they have the subjective experience you have when looking at green, and vice versa. Their whole color spectrum is flipped.
But they still call stop signs red because that's how they learned the word, connected to that specific brain state and wavelength of light.
Exactly. Functionally, they're indistinguishable. The argument is, can you conceive of such a person existing? It seems like we can. If it's conceivable, maybe it's genuinely possible. And if it's possible for 2 physically and functionally identical beings to have different qualia, then qualia can't be fully determined by physical or functional states alone.
Okay. And then the ultimate version of this, philosophical zombies.
The big one. A philosophical zombie is defined as a being that is a perfect physical duplicate of a conscious person.
Every atom, every neural firing, identical.
Identical. And therefore functionally identical, too. It walks, talks, reacts to stimuli, eats, sleeps, might even write philosophy papers about consciousness, behaves exactly like a conscious human.
Inside?
Inside, there's nothing. No subjective experience whatsoever, no qualia, no what it's like to be the zombie. It's all dark inside, lights out.
Like a perfectly programmed automaton.
Precisely. The argument, again, hinges on conceivability. Does it seem conceivable, even if maybe not physically possible in our world, but logically, metaphysically possible, that such a being could exist? If you think, yes, I can conceive of that, then the argument follows. If a perfect physical duplicate can lack consciousness, then consciousness is something over and above the physical and functional organization. It's not necessitated by the physical facts. So physicalism is false.
Wow. Zombies are a powerful tool for thinking about this. So these arguments, Mary, inverted spectra of zombies, they all target that explanatory gap, that feeling the physical and functional descriptions miss the subjective essence.
They really put the pressure on physicalism. But physicalists have pushed back hard, developing counter-arguments.
How do they respond?
Well, one broad strategy is to accept there might be an epistemic gap, a gap in our knowledge or ability to deduce, but deny there's a fundamental metaphysical gap, a gap in reality itself. They might say, look, conscious states are physical states, the link is necessary, but we just can't figure out why it's necessary purely through reason or examining the physical facts. It's a brute necessity we discover empirically.
So water is H2O, necessarily, but you couldn't figure that out just by thinking about the concept water. You needed science. Maybe consciousness and brain states are like that.
That's one line of thought, yes. Other responses focus more directly on attacking the intuition in the Mary case, arguing she doesn't learn genuinely new information that refutes physicalism.
Okay, like the ability hypothesis.
Right. This says Mary doesn't learn a new fact that red feels like this. Instead, she gains new abilities, new know-how. She learns how to imagine red, how to recognize red by sight, how to remember that specific feeling. It's like learning to swim, you gain skills, not propositions.
So it's a change in her abilities, not her factual knowledge base about the physical world.
That's the claim. Relatedly, there's the acquaintance knowledge view. This says she gains a new kind of knowledge through direct acquaintance with the experience itself. Like, you can know all the facts about Paris from books, but you gain a different kind of knowledge, acquaintance knowledge, by actually visiting Paris. Mary just gets acquainted with redness.
A non-propositional kind of knowing.
Exactly. And a third major response involves phenomenal concepts. This is the idea that Mary acquires new concepts, new ways of thinking about color experiences when she sees red. The experience itself might be purely physical, but she now has a new mental tool, a phenomenal concept, to grasp it from the first-person perspective.
But the source mentioned, a worry here. Doesn't this just sound like she found a new way to label something she already knew everything about? Like discovering Cicero and Tully are the same person that feels like a real discovery about the world, not just getting a new name or concept.
That's precisely the debate. Does acquiring the phenomenal concept constitute a genuine discovery about a non-physical property? Or is it just a new cognitive way of accessing a purely physical property you already knew about under a different description? It's tricky.
And then there are the physicalists who basically bite the bullet and say Mary doesn't learn anything genuinely new in a way that threatens their view.
Yeah. Daniel Dennett is famous for this. He argues our intuition that she learned something is based on a massive failure of imagination. We just can't comprehend what knowing all the physical facts would really mean, he asks. If Mary truly knew everything physical, couldn't she predict exactly what seeing red would be like? Couldn't she say, look at her own brain scan while seeing a blue banana, a banana illuminated to look blue, and say, my brain is in the seeing blue state, even though I know it's a yellow banana?
If she had complete knowledge, maybe she wouldn't be surprised at all. She'd recognize the state immediately.
That's Dennett's challenge. He thinks the intuition collapses if you really grasp the premise of complete physical knowledge. But again, many philosophers find the Mary intuition much stronger than that and don't think it stems from simply underestimating physicalism.
So the explanatory gap remains this huge philosophical battleground. Different views on whether it's real, whether it matters.
Exactly. You've got those like Jackson and Chalmers saying the gap is real, unbridgeable, and points to irreducible subjective qualities, property dualism or something similar. You've got people like Searle saying, yes, there's a gap in explanation from third-person physics to first-person feeling, but consciousness is still a biological, physical property, just one with an irreducible subjective nature.
A sort of physicalism that makes room for subjectivity.
Right. Then there's Thomas Nagel, famous for his What Is It Like to Be a Bat paper. He suspected the gap might be bridgeable, but we currently lack the necessary concepts. Our understanding is incomplete.
We need new ways of thinking.
Perhaps. And then there's the most maybe pessimistic or perhaps just realistic view from Colin McGinn, Mysterianism.
Mysterianism.
The idea that there is a physical explanation for consciousness, the gap is bridgeable in principle, but we humans are constitutionally incapable of grasping it. We are cognitively closed to the solution.
Our brains just aren't built to understand how brains create consciousness. Like a dog trying to understand calculus.
That's the analogy. The answer might be purely physical, but it involves concepts or requires an understanding of matter and information that is simply beyond our evolved cognitive capacities.
Wow. That's a humbling thought.
Yeah.
That the limits might be in us, not in reality.
It really puts the whole quest into perspective. And all these debates, they also make you wonder if maybe the way we've set up the problem, this stark mind versus body thing, is part of the issue itself.
Questioning the whole framework.
Exactly. Some perspectives try to move beyond that dichotomy. Think about historical materialism like Marx. Consciousness isn't seen as this isolated internal thing, but as something deeply shaped, even generated by your material conditions, your social environment, your economic activity.
So my thoughts aren't just in my head, they're tied to the world I live in.
In a fundamental way, yes. Similarly, a lot of 20th century continental philosophy, like French structuralism, tended to reject that Cartesian split, seeing the individual subject and their consciousness as woven into broader structures of language, society, power.
And you mentioned the Buddhist model earlier, too.
Right, the five aggregates model. It sees mind not as a single thing, but as this constantly changing flow sensations, feelings, perceptions, intentions, consciousness. And it implicitly accepts two levels of analysis. The third-person view, how the mind works, and the first-person view, the subjective stream of experience.
Which kind of suggests maybe the problem isn't reducing one to the other, but seeing how both perspectives relate.
It offers a completely different starting point, doesn't require that initial separation. And along those lines, remember that Reddit comment we looked at, suggesting maybe the problem isn't mind, but our concept of body or matter.
Ah, right. Maybe physical stuff is weirder or more complex than we assume, so fitting mind into it is the wrong way to think.
Exactly. The comment used Newton's gravity as an example. Action at a distance really challenged the simple matter as billiard balls view of the time. It expanded what physical could mean.
And quantum mechanics takes that much further.
Definitely. The comment mentioned how some interpretations of quantum physics seem to challenge a purely objective, observer-independent physical reality. It pointed to physicists like von Neumann, Wigner, Wheeler, even modern researchers like Hoffman, who've explored interpretations where consciousness or observation plays a more fundamental role, partly because purely physical explanations run into paradoxes or seem incomplete at that level.
Now, we should be clear, these are highly debated interpretations within physics itself.
Oh, absolutely, not mainstream consensus. But the point is that our scientific understanding of matter and physical reality is still very much evolving. It might be far stranger than the simple mechanistic picture that dualism originally reacted against.
So if body itself is mysterious, maybe the mind-body problem looks different.
Perhaps it's not about cramming mind into a well-understood physical box, but about understanding how consciousness relates to a physical world that might itself be deeply strange, maybe even information-based or participatory in some way.
That really does flip the perspective. And there are other philosophical arguments that challenge materialism more directly, too.
Like C.S. Lewis's argument from Reason. His basic point was, if my thoughts are just the result of non-rational physical processes in my brain, like atoms bumping around, how can I trust my reasoning?
If my belief that materialism is true is just a chemical reaction, why should I believe it's actually true?
That was his worry. If reason itself is just fizzing chemicals, it seems to undermine its own validity. Though it's important to note, philosophers like Anscombe pushed back, arguing that a physical process can reliably trap truth or follow logical rules, and Lewis himself later modified his argument. It's not seen as a slam dunk by most philosophers today.
And there was another more recent one, the vertiginous question.
Yeah, building on work by Ben Shelley, Christian List has developed this argument focusing on the first-person perspective. The core question is, why am I this particular conscious subject? Why this specific viewpoint on the world tied to this body and brain and not some other one?
Why am I me?
Exactly. Lista argues that this irreducibly first-personal fact, the fact that I am the one having these experiences, cannot be fully explained or accounted for by purely third-personal objective facts about the world.
Knowing all of the physical facts about my brain doesn't explain why I am the one inside it, looking out.
That's his claim. He argues this points to something fundamental about reality that isn't captured by standard physicalism, which deals only in third-person facts. And interestingly, he thinks it's also a problem for many standard dualist views, if they also try to describe the soul or mind purely in third-person terms.
So even dualism might miss this essential meanness.
It's a subtle but potentially powerful challenge. Now, amidst all this philosophical sparring, we have to keep the neuroscience evidence in mind, too.
Right, the brain scans, the correlations.
The evidence is strong that mental processes are tightly linked to brain processes. You can see activity change with thoughts, feelings, decisions. You can sometimes predict choices before someone is aware of making them. That brain basis is undeniable.
But maybe it's not just the brain. We talked about the brain-gut axis.
Yes. A great example of how the nervous system and our feeling states are influenced by other parts of the body. The mind isn't just locked in the head. And phantom limbs, too.
Feeling vivid sensations from a limb that isn't physically there anymore.
It shows our subjective body map, our sense of self, is constructed by the brain based on complex models, not just a direct feed from the physical body. The mind-body connection is incredibly intricate.
Here, finally, that distinction Robinson made between basic sensory consciousness and abstract social consciousness.
Yeah, that feels really important. He argued that the raw feel of seeing red or feeling pain, basic sensory consciousness, is something fundamental, something even a totally isolated person would have. It's tied to the internal processing we discussed earlier.
But abstract thought, interpretation, understanding the world through language and culture, that's
Yeah.
different.
That's the socially shaped layer. And Robinson's point was, if you confuse these, if you try to explain the raw feeling of pain just by talking about pain behavior or social concepts of pain, you miss the core phenomenon. You fall into a kind of behaviorism. Basic sensation comes first.
So we need to be clear what level of consciousness we're even talking about when we try to explain it.
Absolutely. Are we talking about the raw feel of red or the complex thought, that shade of red reminds me of my grandmother's tablecloth? Very different targets for explanation.
Wow. Okay. We have covered a lot of ground here, from neurons predicting their own activity all the way through Plato, Descartes, functionalism, zombies, and back to questioning the nature of matter itself.
It's a journey, isn't it? We've wrestled with qualia, the explanatory gap, seen the power of these thought experiments, and explored all these different ways philosophers and scientists try to bridge that gap or explain why it's there.
And it's clear there's just no easy consensus, no single answer that satisfies everyone. The sources show compelling arguments, but also deep challenges from every direction.
Scientific, philosophical, even just reflecting on your own first-person experience. It's complex from every angle.
And these aren't just, abstract puzzles for academics. This stuff gets right to the core of who we are. What does it mean to be conscious, to feel, to experience the world from this unique inside perspective? How do we fit into this physical universe?
It forces you to question your most basic assumptions about reality and your place in it.
Which brings us to one last thought to leave you with. Bit provocative, maybe. If some of these ideas are right, if our subjective experience is fundamentally built from the brain's internal predictions, its models of the causes of its own signals, and if our very understanding of the external physical world is itself derived from these internal subjective experiences and predictions, does that mean the reality you perceive, the world you experience right now, is always, in a way, a kind of controlled hallucination, a masterful internal simulation generated by your brain, rather than direct access to some purely objective external world? And if so, what does that imply about the ultimate nature of consciousness and the nature of reality itself?
That is definitely something to mull over.